In his book Islam: The View from the Edge, Richard W. Bulliett discusses the decline in the power and influence of traditional institutions of learning within the broader Muslim world. These are namely the madrasas, and from these madrasas were produced the ulama, the religious scholarly class. These religious scholars, typically speaking, in the classical tradition, were trained in both the religious sciences and later on, in later periods, in the rational sciences and even the more worldly secular sciences, quote unquote. However, due to a number of reasons, such as Western colonialism, the decline in Muslim prosperity, the decline of funding within the Muslim world for these institutions, the power and influence of these madrasas has also declined. These have manifested themselves in a number of ways. One is the dilution of the curricula that is typically taught within these institutions, where the rational and worldly sciences are no longer taught, and even the religious sciences, generally speaking, are not taught to the same degree of proficiency as they were in the past. In general, religious scholarship across the world, or let's say the religious sage class, has generally speaking declined in both quality and quantity. This is true within the Islamic world and in the broader world. But within the Islamic world, that issue has played a much bigger part within the crises that have been internal to that part of the world. This is because the ulama class were one of the most fundamental classes of the Islamic world. They served as guides or illuminaries to the questions that people had about everyday life. And they, of course, served as the people of knowledge and the people of advice, let's say, within their various institutions, their various societies. And so, of course, the rise of alternative institutions, namely of more secular Western institutions, has challenged the traditional authority of the ulama class. Now, of course, modern Western styled secular education institutions have given rise to a class of students who are trained in the worldly sciences, let's say, or who are more knowledgeable about certain secular sciences, just as to use that as a more broad term. This includes engineers, doctors, and lawyers, and people trained in very much Western professions, let's say, even though, of course, being a lawyer or a doctor isn't exclusive to the West. But interestingly enough, in opposition to what you might expect, which is the increasing secularization of these people in such an education system, in fact, the opposite has partially happened, where being disconnected from their own traditions, but not necessarily receiving the full benefits of the Western tradition either, these Muslims in Muslim countries who are trained in these professions that are derived from the West, or they are being trained within these sorts of occupations, despite their lack of knowledge and training within the religious sciences, develop a kind of religious fervor or religious piety, and hence gives the rise of the modern Muslim intellectual who is not necessarily trained in the Islamic sciences, let's say, but he feels that he wants a connection to the Islamic tradition and he seeks to foster that connection. And in many cases, these people are using concepts and ideas which are quite distinctively Western in nature. This oftentimes involves things like the study of sociology or the study of the social sciences or the focus, let's say, on the natural sciences. And this includes Muslims of all orientations, whether they be Sunnis or Shias, the more moderate or reformist types to the more fundamentalist types. For example, it's really interesting that Dr. Khalid Abu al Fadl, in his book Wrestling Islam from the Hands of the Terrorists, he mentions in his book that the fundamentalist groups, so many of these extremist groups, the reality was that many of them were university students who were trained in the natural sciences and they were trained in STEM subjects. Many of them were engineers, many of them were doctors, many of them were scientists. They had very little knowledge about the religious sciences, in fact, and many of them did not receive a kind of religious training within a traditional institution. Yet, this kind of conflict between this Western identity, this more secular identity, and the Islamic identity, and obviously this kind of reaction to modernity and the modernization of their societies, led them to adopt this fundamentalist approach. But the irony was there was this big contradiction at the heart of their fundamentalist approach, where they were quite distinctively trained in the natural sciences in STEM subjects, and they in fact had very little knowledge about their religion, aside from a very literalist reading or a very extreme reading of primary religious literature, namely their scriptures. This also includes the more moderate or reformist types who seek to interpret Islam in light of modern Western concepts, or they seek to interpret the Islamic faith in a more modernist or reformist or secularist manner. And it's really interesting how this modern intellectual class is, in a way, challenging the authority of the traditional institutions of learning, and especially that of the ulama class. And they have very distinctive ideas of Islam, they have very distinctive ideas of how to interpret the Islamic faith and how to understand these religious traditions. The interesting point here to note is that this is giving rise to a new period of creativity and a new period of dynamism, of this kind of dynamic nature of the Islamic religion, where currently the Islamic religion is experiencing a very new period of creativity, where many thinkers that are now associating with the Islamic faith that aren't taught within traditional institutions but are kind of coming from the edge, let's say, or they are coming from the outside and trying to integrate themselves back into what they see to be their own tradition, they are bringing about new ideas and new concepts through which they can understand their religion. These are quite distinctive from the traditional understanding of Islam, the idea of this tradition that has developed, but it's not necessarily entirely Western. They are taking these Western modern concepts and applying them or seeking to refine or interpret them in an Islamic context, or to interpret Islam in light of these principles. And so that's a really interesting thing to note. Of course, there's obviously the issues that do arise with this dynamism as well, where multiple fundamentalist groups have arisen as well as a reaction to modernity. But without a doubt, some of the greatest thinkers of Islam in modern times have been influenced by the West and by many of these Western concepts. Take, for example, somebody like Shariati from Iran, who incorporated or tried to understand how, for example, Shia Islam could be a tool for revolution, and his writings are very influential. Take somebody like Muhammad Iqbal, who is considered the poet of the East, who was trained in philosophy and who developed concepts of the self quite similar to that of Nietzsche's, but he refined it more in an Islamic context. And so this is giving rise to a period of new ideas that are being developed and a new period of creativity for the Islamic faith in the modern era.